I've been on a really crazy Final Fantasy kick lately, and let me tell you, I love it. I grew up playing Final Fantasy, and there are a few games I love more than the Final Fantasy series. But which Final Fantasy games are my favorites? Remember, this is a list of favorites, so if you don't see your favorites, don't get furious. The rules for this list are simple. If it was developed to be named Final Fantasy, regardless of whether or not it's a spin-off, it's eligible. This means that all the games that only share the same universe as Final Fantasy titles, such as how Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII are set in the same world, are not going to be included, no matter how great they are. Alongside those that are ineligible are the first 3 Final Fantasy Legend games, as those are the initial trilogy of Saga series games that just happen to be renamed Final Fantasy in the West. Again, if it's Final Fantasy proper, it's up for grabs. So, hey, I'm AsaiNeroTran, and these are our top 10 favorite Final Fantasy games. This didn't make the list for some reason, but I want to talk about it anyway.
Hooray!
Chrono Trigger is the best 16-bit RPG of all time, and that's something that's very difficult to argue. The reason it's an honorable mention, obviously, is because it's not a Final Fantasy game. It was made by the minds behind Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and featured art from the man behind Dragon Ball. That's a dream team, and the mechanics allowed for team attacks 21 and a half years before Final Fantasy XV came out. The story had multiple endings, with multiple possible scenarios and setups, each having different outcomes, and it's only as long as it needs to be, which is an important and often overlooked detail that really lends itself towards the overall quality of the game. If you haven't played Chrono Trigger yet, I'd recommend playing the DS version of the game, as it features the animated cutscenes that were added to the PlayStation version, but has the seamless gameplay without the loading screens that the Super Nintendo version had. And it added a bunch of optional content that is really the cherry on top. Again, the only reason this is not on the list proper is because it is not a proper Final Fantasy game. But I truly believe that Chrono Trigger is the greatest 16-bit RPG of all time. And I know I'm not the only one. 10. Crisis Core is basically Square-Enix answering all the clamoring fans' desires for a new Final Fantasy VII related, well, anything. And it's actually really good! Crisis Core served as a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, fleshing out various characters' backgrounds, introducing a bunch of new characters, and even overlapping with a bunch of things that were seen in Final Fantasy VII itself. Crisis Core has a real-time combat system, featuring many of the classic Final Fantasy VII battle tropes, including materia in all its glory, which can still be combined with other materia on a linked materia weapon slot to create unique magical combinations. It also introduces completely new mechanics, such as the digital Mind Wave slot machine, which has a variety of potential effects, including limit breaks, stat boosts, and even a few Easter eggs. Crisis Core is a really fun game, and despite being just a prequel, it's still full of surprises for both Final Fantasy VII newcomers and Final Fantasy VII fans alike. 9. Let's stick with the spin-offs for now, with one of the multiplayer entries in the series. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light are both really fun games, and both games have awesome 4-player co-op. On the flip side, the multiplayer for Crystal Chronicles requires the game, the GameCube, 4 Game Boy Advance systems, and the cables to link the Game Boy Advance systems to the GameCube, while the 4 Heroes of Light only requires each player have the game and the Nintendo DS. But Crystal Chronicles allows you to play the main campaign with 3 friends, while the multiplayer for 4 Heroes of Light is simply a multiplayer mode. The answer is, truly, a flip of a coin. But for us, it's Crystal Chronicles, because while it's much harder overall to play the game with 4 players, the fact that you can play the campaign with 4 people instead of just a multiplayer mode really makes it for us. Couple that with the fact that the combat in Crystal Chronicles is real-time compared to the turn-based combat of the 4 Heroes of Light, and you have a truly unique experience from Crystal Chronicles that you don't have from the 4 Heroes of Light. Take your pick on which side you like more, but for us, it's Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. 8. Heading back to the main series of games, but sticking with the multiplayer motif, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn and Final Fantasy XI are phenomenal MMORPGs. Again, there's no right answer for which one you prefer, but our preference is Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, as you could play with everyone who owned the game, regardless of whether they had it on PS3, PS4, or PC. You also had constant support with updates, patches, rebalancing, and added features, and the Heavensward expansion was awesome. Plus, the newest expansion, Stormblood, is set to release in June, and it looks just as great. Again, there's no right or wrong answer for this one. If you prefer Final Fantasy XI, that's also a great game. But no matter what, it's hard to deny that Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn is absolutely fantastic. 7. Here's an oldie but a goodie. The original Final Fantasy was undoubtedly one of the most unbelievably great games ever released. Dragon Quest may have been the blueprint for what we know as the traditional JRPG, but Final Fantasy was the benchmark for what JRPGs should be. The game had so much to it that it's hard to believe it was on the NES. You start the game by going to the Kingdom of Corneria, speaking with the king, hunting down the traitorous Knight Garland, fighting all his minions, taking Garland down, rescuing Princess Sarah, returning her to the king, and then the introduction for the game begins. It may not sound like a lot today, but that prologue was as long as the entirety of some games back in the day. And if it does sound like a lot by today's standards, then imagine the rest of the game. It's absolutely legendary among JRPG lovers, the way that Final Fantasy starts. Nowadays, there are a plethora of better games, both in quality of content and in quantity of content. But as they say, you can't beat the classics. And the original Final Fantasy is certainly a classic. 6. There's no doubt that the original Final Fantasy is a classic. Final Fantasy IX, however, embodies the way we remember the classics. No matter how good the original Final Fantasy was, today, it certainly feels dated. Final Fantasy IX, however, captures the magic of the originals while updating the feel of the gameplay. A nod to the heyday of traditional JRPG tropes, Final Fantasy IX was a breath of fresh air after the neo-noir steampunk feel of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. It brought back the old-school character classes, like the Black Mage, the Thief, and the Fighter, and it pays homage to the traditional stylings of the series overall, with colorful characters, an engaging but easy-to-follow story, for the most part, and all the trimmings we've grown to know and love about Final Fantasy. A true nostalgia trip for fans of the series, and a great starting point for newcomers to Final Fantasy as well, Final Fantasy IX is not only one of the best Final Fantasy games, but one of the best games on the original PlayStation. 5. Final Fantasy Tactics is phenomenal. The epitome of everything a Final Fantasy spin-off should be, Tactics boasts a plethora of interesting characters, a great story featuring espionage and intrigue over an old-school setting, very well-defined and fleshed-out gameplay, and even a bunch of Easter eggs for fans of the series to find and enjoy. Many could argue that Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift are better games for various reasons, but Final Fantasy Tactics has many gameplay features that are much more straightforward and therefore easier to master. Another PS1 classic, Final Fantasy Tactics was so good that it was actually remade for the PlayStation Portable, and the PSP remake was ported over to the iOS as well, featuring new Easter eggs and side quests for fans of the series to find and enjoy all over again. While the PSP version was a nice little throwback, there's nothing quite like playing the old-school Final Fantasy Tactics on the PS1. 4. Final Fantasy XV may be the newest fully fledged game in the series, but it brings a lot to the table. A stark departure from the traditional stylings of Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy XV features a brand new real-time action combat system, a modern, or at least postmodern, or near-futuristic setting, and a fully realized in-game world that looks and feels like it's teeming with life. The world changes as you play, albeit in small and subtle ways, and there's so much to see and do that it's wholly evident that Square-Enix began conceptualizing this game 10 years ago. The story may be a little bit less developed than your typical Final Fantasy game, But this is by design, as it's much more easily digested without all the superfluous backstory. Not to say that there isn't backstory, but it's only what you need so that you know what's going on, which is, again, a vast departure from previous entries like Final Fantasy XIII, where you have to have an understanding of the vast inner workings of the geopolitical climate of the locales in order to make sense of anything. No, Final Fantasy XV understands that it should present a story that people can enjoy, and it cedes any extra details around the world for the truly hardcore of the hardcore to find, discover, and love. I love Final Fantasy XV. I even got the Platinum Trophy in the game, which took over 130 hours, by the way, to accomplish, and I enjoyed every last second of it. 3. The top 5 spots on this list were superbly difficult to place, and on any given day, Final Fantasy XV could be number 3. But today, we're feeling the love for Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XV has a world teeming with life at every turn, but Final Fantasy XII had just as vivid and lively a world as 15 did, and 12 was released 10 years prior. We've already covered how much we love the Evilus Alliance games here on this channel, but for posterity, we'll reiterate Final Fantasy XII's depiction of the world of Evilus is amazing on all fronts. It's really quite amazing that a game so rich and colorful was released in 2006, but Final Fantasy XII really accomplished every Final Fantasy XV aspect a decade prior, with bounty hunts, super bosses, battles that happen to be on the overworld instead of happening on a separate battle screen, and a cast of interesting characters. Again, it's a toss-up between Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy XV, and there's really no wrong answer. But today, we're giving the coveted number 3 spot to the amazing Final Fantasy XII. Alright, there are 3 big games we haven't mentioned and only 2 spots left on this list. So which games are going to get first and second, and which games are going to get the axe between Final Fantasy VI, 7, and 10? But first, let's hit that recap. Number 10, Crisis Core. Number 9, Crystal Chronicles. Number 8, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Number 7, Final Fantasy I. Number 6, Final Fantasy IX. Number 5, Final Fantasy Tactics. Number 4, Final Fantasy 15. And number 3, Final Fantasy 12. So which Pandora's box are we going to open first? Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy X are all beloved entries in a revered series, and leaving any of them off our top 10 is asking for trouble. So, well, let's just go through them one at a time. Final Fantasy VI is one of the best 16-bit RPGs of all time, arguably the best, and features many heartwarming and heart-wrenching moments that people remember fondly today. The gameplay for the traditional turn-based JRPG was perfected in Final Fantasy VI. The game's music gave us many of the series' most iconic scenes, and the villain Kefka was truly among the baddest of the bad. And just when you think the game is almost over and you're on your way to the final boss, Final Fantasy VI throws a curveball and sends you back on the adventure, this time with a cataclysmically destroyed planet and vastly different environments. This allows the player to see how truly awful Kefka is, and makes defeating him so much more satisfying. Many people say that Final Fantasy VII is their favorite video game, let alone their favorite Final Fantasy game. An uncanny departure from the traditional high fantasy that the series was known for, Final Fantasy VII gave us a steampunk neo-noir setting with a parade of interesting characters, both heroic and villainous. With some of the series' most recognized and beloved music, a new battle mechanic and limit breaks that fundamentally change the gameplay, and a story that, without a doubt, plays the long game by seeding backstory details early on and allowing the player to unravel the mysteries of the world 40 hours later, Final Fantasy VII is a fantastic standout for both fans and newcomers alike. Final Fantasy X is another one of people's favorite games, and was the first Final Fantasy game released on the PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy X revamped the combat altogether, with Aeons replacing the traditional summoning mechanic, and the conditional time battle system allowing for a more strategic decision-making process compared to earlier entries. However, Final Fantasy X also maintains the limit break system of Final Fantasy VII via overdrives, adding player input to limit breaks, which allows for more tangible and rewarding super attacks. Plus, the game's world is so massive and well imagined that Square-Enix actually created a direct sequel so that fans could see and experience more of the Final Fantasy X world, which goes to show how much love and demand there was for more Final Fantasy X. So between these three heavy hitters, which games are number 2 and 1? 2. There's no denying how fantastic Final Fantasy VI is as a game. As we said, it's damn near perfect, truly the epitome of the 16-bit JRPG in many ways. The story, the music, the villain, the gameplay, all of it came together to craft something better than the sum of its parts. And Final Fantasy VI stands the test of time as one of the best games any human being can experience. And that means our number 1 has to be Final Fantasy... 7. Sure, Final Fantasy X had a great environment and great mechanics, but Final Fantasy VII created all the demand for more spin-offs and sequels for a reason. The characters in Final Fantasy VII are all incredibly interesting and amazing in their own rights, which is evident by the chapter where Cloud and Tifa leave the party, and the remaining cast must hold the game's plot all on their own. Plus, while Final Fantasy X was the first entry to get a direct sequel, Final Fantasy X-2 kind of really sucks a lot. It's the skeleton of a good game, with no heart or soul, no substance. And while you could argue that Dirge of Cerberus sucks just as much, if not more, Final Fantasy VII got a prequel in Crisis Core, a movie and an expanded movie in Advent Children and Advent Children Complete, multiple OVAs, a handful of mobile games based on the minigames found in Final Fantasy VII's in-game arcade, the Gold Saucer, and a complete remake, not just an HD remaster, that's coming out in the near future. To top it all off, in our opinion, the story of Final Fantasy VII is better, with a nigh unstoppable villain and a super corporation fighting against a ragtag group of rebels, similar to the setup of Star Wars. Hell, Final Fantasy VII even has Biggs and Wedge. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy X has a villain who wants to stop the pointless death of everyone by becoming what is essentially the embodiment of death, and then killing everyone. Also, it has this. Any way you slice it, Final Fantasy VII is our favorite Final Fantasy game. But damn if we don't love the series altogether. Hey guys, AsaiNeroTran here, in case you didn't know who I was, even though my face has been on these videos on this channel before, and it's in every thumbnail. Sorry I haven't been very active on YouTube recently. It's because I just started a podcast called the Pixel Perfect Plexcast. It airs every single Friday night on SoundCloud and iTunes. It covers all the latest and greatest happenings and news, and we review stuff in video games and in the pro wrestling world. I'd say give it a listen. If it's not your thing, I don't blame you, just because it covers two different topics that not everybody is really going to be into, like, at the same time. But I'd say listen to just one. We have 14 or 15 episodes up, depending on when this video comes out or when you're watching it. We could have 1 billion episodes up if you're watching it in the future. I don't have that technology, but yeah. Yeah, just give it a listen. All the links are in the description below. If you like it, please follow us on SoundCloud. Please follow the podcast on iTunes. Otherwise, just subscribe to this channel if you like the video. Also, throw us a like and let us know what you want to see on this channel. We got more stuff on the way. All that is down below or wherever the description box is whenever you're watching this. Otherwise, we got other stuff coming to the channel. We have more AsaiNeroTran videos coming. I already finished scripting out one of them. I just need to record it and edit it. The other one I have coming up afterwards. I started writing it already, so I'm really excited about both these videos coming out. I'm sure you guys are really going to like it. More top 10s, and hey, maybe we'll start uploading little clips of the podcast up so that you can check it out on here without committing to like the whole episode of the podcast. So let us know if you'd like to see that. Let us know if you'd like to hear that. Let us know what you're most excited about and what you want to see. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. That's more than I thought it was going to be. So here's the end card. Go.